Welcome to Dire Straits. I'm Amanda Monty.
I'm Tracy Clark-Flory.
Today we're digging into an age-old question along the lines of, has feminism ruined the workplace? Or has feminism pushed men into the manosphere? Or did feminism get Trump elected?
Today we're hosting a roundtable with a bunch of people who are pro-marriage, anti-divorce, and don't believe women should have any rights, called Did Feminism Ruin the Family? Just kidding. More seriously, we're asking whether feminists and progressives today are anti-family.
We'll talk about the trap of that framing and why being against the nuclear family is good, actually. We'll also talk about how people today are panicking about the state of the family while failing to propose any meaningful policies that would benefit those who are most harmed by the nuclear unit. That is, children and women.
We're going to dig into the political potential baked into expansive ideas around kinship and talk about alternative ways of viewing family.
This episode is totally free because we really want you to have it. If you find this episode helps you rethink your concept of family or feminism, please rate us on your podcast apps, share the episode with everyone you know and on your socials, and join our Substack community at direstraitspod.com. That's straits with a GH. You'll get all of our episodes, no paywalls ever, along with special bonus episodes and subscriber chats.
And just a quick note, we have been delivering timely, deeply researched, hour-long episodes to your inbox 2 times a month for a whole year. Can you believe it?
And just a reminder that we produce, edit, and write this show all by ourselves. It's been so fun, and we've been totally blown away by the support and the buzz the show has received.
This is our final episode of the first ever season of Dire Straits. We're developing our next season this summer and have some really exciting ideas in store. We won't be releasing any new episodes for a few weeks, but just know behind the scenes, we are working super hard to cook up some really good stuff for you.
And we will be back in August with some brand new episodes. In the meantime, join us at direstraitspod.com and let us know what you most want to see us cover in season 2. So let's start by talking a little bit about our concepts of family growing up. We've each talked about this here and there across episodes, but I think so many of us define our families either in opposition to how we were raised, if we had a bad experience, or as a copy of how we were raised if we had a good one. Tracy, I felt like this would be the perfect time for this episode because you have recently written a whole book about your family and its secrets. And at the time of recording, you have just birthed that book into the world. What clarity do you have on the notion of family that you grew up with?
So I grew up in a very nuclear family. It was our little trio, me, my mom, my dad, and you know, as I've talked about in past episodes, I had this idea of us as a happy family, opposite, less happy families or fractured families that I saw, among my friends, for example. But of course, there was a secret at the heart of our happy nuclear family.
Mm-hmm.
I just published this whole book about how, when my mom was a teenager, she got pregnant. It was the 60s. Her father sent her away to a home for unwed mothers where she placed her baby, my sister, for adoption. Those systems were in service of rerouting unwed pregnant women into the family home, into the nuclear family, by essentially giving them another shot by way of placing their babies for adoption and hiding the evidence of their pregnancy, of becoming proper women and wives and mothers, right? So the idea was to reroute women like my mom toward marriage. Eventually, she did end up getting married, right? Many years later. And my parents, in some ways, had a non-traditional marriage. They were hippies. We lived in Berkeley. They gave me a hyphenated last name. They maintained separate bank accounts. They had separate bedrooms. It was a very sex positive household. My mom really surrounded herself with queer women friends. I was also exposed early on to this idea of chosen family by way of my mom's women friends, who she, referred to as our Berkeley family. But all that said, I also had a real sense of having been lucky for having two happily married parents. I definitely grew up believing in the dream of marriage and the nuclear model. And lo and behold, I have found myself within marriage and the nuclear family, which is something I have questioned a bit, especially as I wrote this book that, really reckons with how the nuclear family is a tool of women's oppression.
Yeah, I do find it so interesting how your family life looks similar to the family life you grew up with now. Obviously, there's like a lot of sort of intergenerational pattern breaking that you're doing as well, to put it lightly. Yeah. But I'm going to talk about my experience growing up, and it's interesting to see how where I am now is very similar to the environment that I grew up in as well.
Yeah, that is fascinating. Yeah, so tell us.
Yes.
Tell us about that environment growing up.
Yeah. Well, my parents were divorced when I was in second grade. So, I mean, the core of my childhood was spent with single mom, divorced parents. But I think even like backing up further, my mom had a real vision of like the nuclear family that I think was very mythical and unrealistic. And I think she identified with a lot of sort of longing to fulfill that ideal. Like that was something that was always kind of talked about in my house. Her family was also like kind of a mess. There was estrangement. There was a lot of not getting along, a lot of ups and downs in terms of like class and wealth and just interpersonal conflict. So I grew up with this like vision of the nuclear family that I can see now was pretty unrealistic and kind of imaginary. But the fact that we were not that was kind of a big part, I think, of how I grew up. I grew up in a lot of different houses. My mom was moving a lot. So for a time, my mom rented a kind of white picket fence type house. And then after that, we moved into an apartment above an electrical company. I was just thinking about this the other day, like how strange that was. And it was like on the corner of a busy street. It was like it became a party house. My mom also like ran her entertainment agency out of like the living room area. So, it was like a very working single mom home. Obviously a lot of the like girls that I went to school with, they had like nice houses, right? And I was like living in this little apartment. I distinctly remember a few girls who were not allowed to go to my house because we were a bad influence. We were the party house. Finally, when I was in high school, my mom bought a house, and I felt like she really saw real estate as like this sign that she was, going to be stable, or that we had like something more like a real family, a real future, and a lot of that was like class stability, right? Financial stability was what she wanted. But that house actually ended up becoming a pretty dark place for all of us, for me, especially as a teen. I had a boyfriend who was a pot dealer, who my mom would like buy pot, from. So there was drugs, there was addiction, there was like, a bad boyfriend, that my mom had. So I was very exposed to sex and, drugs and addiction. At the same time, I have these memories of going on vacations with just my mom and my sister and being really close. And having so much fun together and not having a dad in the picture, which is something like I now as a single mom think about a lot. But yeah, I think by my 20s, like when I was a party girl, I longed for a stable family. And when I got married and I had kids, I threw myself on the altar of intensive parenting and marriage, which I write about in my book, touched out, and I thought that was what was going to be good for my kids. I thought that was how I would sort of break the cycle, right? To disappear myself and be this kind of perfect mom. So I thought we should start by talking about this idea of stability, because it comes up a lot in discussions of family and the nuclear family. It's so loaded, and it's this term that's tossed around so much to insist that, women should stay in bad marriages for the sake of the kids because it's somehow more stable, right? But what does stability really mean or look like? So I'm curious, like, what does it mean to you now?
Yeah, I mean, well, growing up, for me, it basically meant that I had a dad who stuck around, a dad who was loving and involved and supportive, which of course isn't actually dependent on marriage or the nuclear family, but it felt that way growing up from seeing my friends' families and also witnessing the way that my parents talked about those families that split up, sometimes because the dad had, a new girlfriend or whatever the case was. And as we've discussed in the pod in the past, like, the roving dad always seemed to me as a kid like a threat to family stability. And marriage was like the promise that a dad would stick around and be invested in his kids.
Interesting.
Also, like, my idea of stability was very narrow. It was just the three of us. And while my mom was really good at building connections with my broader extended family, while she was really good at, bringing together the quote unquote Berkeley family, our chosen family, it did ultimately come down to just us three, which now feels to me like a very unstable table, just those three legs. What did stability mean for you? I'm curious.
Yeah, well, it's so interesting what you said about the dad. I hadn't thought about that. I saw my dad regularly as a kid, but we weren't like emotionally close. So I don't know, we'll have to talk about this in an upcoming episode on daddy issues.
Yeah.
But certainly I think probably as a kid it meant that the parents were still married, and honestly growing up in like suburban LA, it probably meant like a certain degree of morality, Christianity. Like, I was surrounded by a lot of that growing up. But I think that was the problem, is that for me stability meant a marriage. It meant a nuclear family, which we're going to unpack today. But I've also come to realize that what it means to me now, for my kids as a mom, is really that I just want my kids to not have to parent the adults in the room. It means like having a home without conflict and addiction and parental like depression. It means being present and there for my kids and invested in their activities, their lives, their school stuff, but really like just being someone that they can talk to, that they can trust, that they can count on. I was really close with my mom growing up, but I'm now really aware as a mother of like the difference between being like a friend to your child, which I do want to be, but also being that sturdy and steady force for them and a role model, and eventually that I realized if I really wanted to be that for both my, daughter and my son, my kids of, whatever gender, I had to get sober. And I had to leave my marriage, so that I could model like living a more, a life that had some integrity to it. And so that was a big shift for me, because I had always thought like to show up for my kids, to like have a good, healthy home, it meant just not getting a divorce, which is crazy to me when I say it out loud now. But I really do think that that is kind of how I saw it when I first got married.
Right. Yeah. Amazing.
Do you feel like your sense of what is stable or healthy has changed since you got married, became a parent?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I went into marriage really wanting to kind of I don't know, kind of mess with it, play with it, do my feminist version of it, right? Like I had my wedding where we, attempted to do things a little bit counter to tradition, right? I kept my name. I did, all the things, right? But I think especially in parenthood, came up against all the ways that outside culture of the nuclear family and marriage creep in, even when you're trying very intentionally to kind of resist some of those temptations. And we've talked about this so many times on the show about, the sort of heteronormative parenting context where it's like the moms hang with the moms, the dads hang with the dads. Like, you're kind of drafted into this culture of the nuclear family as a parent. And I would say that especially now, after finding my sister, that's the story told in my book, My Mother's Daughter, which I've talked about on the pod several times now. But if for those who are just discovering us, I discovered my sister through a DNA test. And that set me off on this journey to understand our mom's past, her being sent away to a home for unwed mothers in the 60s, right? And through that process of coming together with my sister and her extended family, her sons, her grandkids, and coming to understand the history of these institutions that my mom was sent to, and that fractured my family, I have really started to question marriage and the nuclear family as a form of social control. And so my ideal vision of family stability now feels much broader. And so while my nuclear family is, similar to my childhood, it's just the three of us, mom, dad, and kid, I guess you could say that I'm aspiring to a table with far more legs, right? And stability to me now looks like, building and maintaining all sorts of connections in all areas of my life, but also helping my kid to do the same across his life. And like teaching him to find his own sense of connection and stability and belonging beyond just our little nuclear unit, that home isn't safety. Home alone isn't safety. I want him to be able to find a sense of belonging and a sense of home in the world, not just in the nuclear family home, which, if I'm honest, is something I feel like I, as an adult, am continuing to try to struggle to do, right? Is to find that broader sense of belonging that isn't just about this protected space of the home.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, and there's so much nuance there that I think is lost when we're like, okay, well, Tracy's married and has a kid, and, that looks similar to her childhood, right? There's all these other things happening, and how you're sort of negotiating your sense of family. As you said, you wrote a whole book about it, and same, I think in my experience, right, it could be easy to say, okay, Amanda was raised by a single mom and now she's a single mom. Sure, maybe there's a level of comfort that I developed with that growing up around it, right? But I feel like my kids' childhoods could not be more different than my own. But what's interesting hearing you talk about all this is that I'm starting to think that while we think of stability as being tied to the nuclear family often, or other people do, in fact, the way we're defining it is much more about this negotiation with the trauma of patriarchy, right? That a healthy family is doing that work in their own way, and sort of working through, all these power imbalances and, oppressions and inequality. And like you said, the isolation of the home and the family, and trying to move towards something more expansive rather than you have a stable home if your parents are married.
Right. Yes, a much more communal sense of home and belonging.
Totally. Yeah. Okay, so I want us to just back up a little bit and discuss the origins of the nuclear family, right? Because we often sort of take it for granted as a model for what we talk about when we talk about family. So for our listeners who maybe did not read Sylvia Federici's Caliban and the Witch, we're doing a lot of Federici today, which I'm very excited about.
Always.
And if you want to understand, how, say, the witch hunts, enclosure of communal space and communal living, the consolidation of women's free labor in the home, how all these things coincided with the birth of capitalism and created what we now think of as the nuclear family, that is the book for you to read. It's so good.
Yeah.
Federici talks about how the nuclear family came to be viewed as the primary unit of patriarchal capitalism. So a place where women were isolated in their homes, where their unpaid labor could be extracted and used by the new economic system without, of course, giving them any pay or benefits at all, right? This was also when the work of reproduction and capitalist production really became separate spheres historically. So with women relegated to the home, again, alone, isolated, doing all this unpaid reproductive and domestic work. Previously, Federici writes, this is a quote, "In the feudal village, no social separation existed between the production of goods and the reproduction of the workforce. All work contributed to the family's sustenance. Capitalism introduced a drastic separation between production and reproduction." And this is like a little soapbox that I try to get on all the time, right? Like when we think of private and public spheres as totally separate, we're going to continue to have so many of the problems of exploiting women's labor that we see today. And it's impossible to sort of resolve that. Should women be identified with the home, or should they be, bosses out in the world, right? Because we're seeing these two spheres as so separate rather than united as they once were.
Right. And prior to capitalism and colonialism, there were a lot of other ways of thinking about family. Pre-colonial African families relied on extended kinship systems. Indigenous people in pre-colonial America often had matrilineal and matrilocal family systems where husbands were expected to join the wife's extended family. In pre-colonial China and India, fathers often didn't have parental rights or roles in children's lives.
Right. The nuclear family is such a colonial Western concept. And of course, today, many cultures and countries do not rely on the unit of the nuclear family, which, to be clear, is usually identified as, two heterosexual parents and, 2.5 kids or whatever, right? 1, 2, 3 kids in a private home, that kind of model. And throughout history, there's also always been resistance to the nuclear family. So when we hear discourse today of, the crazy progressives and feminists who are shaking up the family, right? There's always been resistance to the nuclear family ever since it became a model unit of capitalism. Angela Saini writes in the book, The Patriarchs, quote, "The traditional, that is white, Northern European, middle-class nuclear family, although historically represented as a natural endpoint of human evolution, over several centuries and in many different cultures, the tenets of the nuclear family have been challenged by varieties of utopian experiments in alternate living."
Yeah. And it's not a secret that, given its origins, feminists have been critical of the nuclear definition of family, not of women having or loving children or even men, but this particularly limited way of thinking about family. Adrienne Rich wrote about how the nuclear family privatizes love, cuts women off from broader social and communal ties, traps women economically, and is a tool for controlling women's sexuality, right? Bell Hooks really wrote against the idea that the nuclear family is the only container for love, and instead wrote about how it's a breeding ground for abuse.
Yes, and even Susan Sontag called the nuclear family a psychological and moral disaster. So, yes, feminists have been out here telling us for a long time.
Yeah.
Critiques of the nuclear family are not new. And they're not even, just Western feminist, as we've discussed. Yeah. So how does this contrast with how people today tend to talk about family? When we hear politicians and pundits talk about the family, it's often as part of an anti-feminist, pro-marriage, anti-divorce agenda. So I pulled a few recent statements made by conservatives and liberals, or moderates, we'll discuss, about the breakdown of the American family. And I thought I could get your responses on the fly, Tracy. Are you game?
I'm ready. Let's do it.
Okay. So this one is by a man I know that you love and respect and admire, J.D. Vance.
Ooh. Oh.
J.D. Vance has said a lot of things, but one example, having kids just fundamentally changes your perspective on things. He said, "My family is the most important thing in my life. I don't apologize for that." What are your thoughts on this statement? That kids fundamentally changes your perspective on things on the world, and that his family is the most important thing in his life, and he should not have to apologize for that.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much going on there, right? Like, I mean, it makes me think of the girl dad thing of men who are like, oh, I believe in women's rights because I had a daughter. Like this sort of the narratives that we see across the political spectrum that are about how children change you as a person, right? That you couldn't have been transformed, morally oftentimes without having children, which is just so interesting. Also this idea that anyone expects him to apologize for it. Also his presentation of himself as his family being the most important thing in his life. He's literally vice president of the United States of America. He is this incredibly ambitious man,
right.
Wrote a New York Times bestselling book that's terrible, and but he's a very ambitious human being.
Right.
Craven and conniving also, but so it's really interesting to hear him be but family, right. And how would we contrast that with how the right wing presents women's role within the family and the importance of children to them, and how interesting to have this very powerful man talking about the centrality of kids. It rings false to me.
Right. Not to mention his we discussed this in our Tech Bros episode, his past with his VC firm that was named after Lord of the Rings.
Right.
Yeah, I know. I'm very skeptical that the most important thing in J.D. Vance's life is his family. And again, what does that mean? Does that mean his wife, who he has openly said he's trying to convert to a different religion, right? Does it mean his kids, who, as far as I can tell, he does not take care of? What? So what does that mean to say family is the most important thing in your life?
Well,
yeah.
Also, when a man like him is saying it, yeah, indeed, are they most important as sort of equals, or are they most important as property?
Exactly.
That reflect upon him.
Right. Because as you said, doing craven, awful things in the world actually seems like what's most important to him. So yeah. Okay.
Right.
So boo.
Always boo.
But again, you said, I mean, it is this really poignant reminder of the way that conservatives have sort of co-opted this notion of family as being about care and love and all these valuable things, right? And in truth, it doesn't take that much to see that that's not really what these dudes are all about.
Yeah. No.
Okay, this is a quote by Kevin Roberts, the president of the Heritage Foundation, which I know we also love.
Yes.
He says the family is the foundation of every healthy society. And tragically, the American family is on the brink. We are dangerously close to being unable to reverse the decline. Our country will not survive if families continue to crumble at this rate.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is like that. This is the Heritage Foundation talking point, right? That like the family, the nuclear family, this very narrow definition of family, and specifically like the hetero married nuclear family, is the foundational unit of society, as opposed to more expansive notions of neighbors being the essential unit of society. Jelani Cobb, writer at The New Yorker, said exactly this recently, which was that neighbors are the fundamental unit, that it's like our this broader sense of community and investment and connection. But the Heritage Foundation and the right wing in general is going to just keep pushing the nuclear family as the organizing principle of society.
Yeah, totally. I mean, the crisis frame here is also just so problematic, right? That like families are on the brink, like we have to reverse this terrible decline. What does that mean, right? That there are less nuclear families today, that single moms are on the rise, and that they're actually enjoying their lives. You know, and then the notion of like the healthy society, I also find so problematic, right? Like, you know, what are the metrics that we're using to determine the health of a society? Is it gender equality? Is it racial equality? You know, or is it capitalist financial growth? You know, so it's like all these terms like bag interrogation.
Yeah, and they're like, okay, they want to talk about the crisis of the nuclear family, but the thing is that like people do feel this sense of insecurity and instability, right? That the nuclear family is supposed to kind of solve for, but the right wing is like very intentionally and strategically trying to undermine any broader sense of a social safety net that might make people feel less in crisis outside of the nuclear family, right?
Totally.
You know, so they are intentionally trying to make life outside of the nuclear family terrifying and next to impossible.
Right, exactly. Right. And so, of course, anyone outside the nuclear model is going to have a more financially, at least, unstable life, because that is the intentional design of public policy. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this notion of you know, the site of social reproduction being in crisis. But I want to turn your attention to Brad Wilcox, a pro-marriage guy. He says family structure, which is an interestingly vague term, is one of the strongest predictors we have for whether children and communities are thriving. So again, we have that health frame, but specifically calling attention to children and communities thriving based on what we can assume he's referring to as the nuclear structure. Thoughts?
Right. I mean, God, must we unpack all the trauma and abuse that happens within the nuclear family? You know, I mean, it's just, it's absurd.
Yeah, right. Yes, I know. That's always absent from these perspectives, right?
Yeah.
That home is the most unsafe place for women, and how much child abuse happens within the nuclear family, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's look at Emma Waters, who's this young Heritage Foundation pundit. She has been sort of a figurehead for the Heritage Foundation's new play to kind of exploit the exhaustion with the trad versus girl boss rhetoric. She said this: women should be their husband's battle mate, because that's what men want, she says. That is, quote, smart, hardworking wives, but not necessarily career queens. She has also said things like kids are more important than career, and be a mom first and a career woman later.
Yeah. I mean, they really want to tell you that you can put kids and marriage first and a career can come later.
Mm-hmm.
They swear, they promise, you know, but it's a lie. They want women to get trapped within the family, you know?
Right, right.
This is the whole like third option of not trad wife, not girl boss, is actually just trad wife.
Right, exactly.
When it comes down to it.
Right. Well, I always find it funny in these conversations how like financial dependence on men is reframed as this like alluring thing and as this kind of like business partnership, right? Marriage as business partnership. You know, you're going to pool your resources and you're going to get rich together. Like that's the goal.
Right.
And again, there's just the binary between like, you know, the maternal self, the careerist self, right? There's no world in which we're unpacking like why that binary exists for women only.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and is Emma Waters talking about the fact that conservatives are trying to repeal no-fault divorce,
Right,
you know?
right,
like, is she confronting that? Like, is she being honest about that? That there's also this really widespread systemic attempt at making it harder for women to leave their marriages.
Right. Right. To get pregnant young, to get married young, and then to make it impossible to leave.
Yeah, to leave.
So turning to a more liberal Emma Greedy, who is sort of like the new Sheryl Sandberg. She's the author of a recent book, Start With Yourself, which says a lot in the title. She was a founding partner of Skims, and she's been kind of going viral lately for her really sort of like old school boss, quote unquote, feminism. She has said things like, if I'm good, like as the mom, the whole family is good. She prioritizes career, like very explicitly. She also, as a mother, has said she prioritizes being a core memory and a 3-hour mom. That phrase kind of went viral. And she said things like, I love being a mom, but it isn't everything. And that kids' jobs are not to satisfy their moms.
I have so many questions. What is a 3-hour mom?
Oh, so a 3-hour mom is like, that's like the amount of time that she'll spend with her kids, right? So she like prioritizes spending like minimal time with your kids and, you know, really playing by, this is my interpretation, really playing by sort of men's roles in the workforce, right? So not working from home because that's going to privilege you in the workplace. You know, so it really is that like old Sheryl Sandberg, like lean in mentality of like, you need to show up just like the men show up.
Right. Fascinating. Okay. Well, unfortunately, she's just giving other Emma more material to work with, right?
Right.
That's too bad. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because some of what she says, like, I think is not that controversial, right? Like the idea that like a mother's whole value as a human shouldn't be tied to her children. To me, like, I agree. You know, that's a lot of pressure to put on a child, and women are whole humans, right? Like, I love being a mom, but it is not the whole of my identity,
right?
You know, and like sort of pushing back against intensive parenting standards as well. But then there's also laced in her sort of rhetoric hyper-capitalist mentality, a lack of discussion around structural change, you know, a lack of awareness of you know, how workplaces are set against women and all these other things that we need to be discussing. Yeah.
Right. Wild.
It's interesting because it's like a kind of return to that 2010s. Like, why are we spinning our wheels?
Why do we just keep doing this? Yeah, round and round we go.
Yeah, like, come on. Sort of on that tip, I've seen a lot of liberal feminists lately play into this kind of mentality by saying like that they're pro-marriage or pro-family. But what I find frustrating is not questioning what those terms mean, right? What does it mean to be pro-family, and how is that framing already in and of itself, you know, sort of setting a trap for those of us that want to think about family in this more expansive communal way? Or like you said with, you know, in terms of Jelani Cobb's brilliant notion of thinking about the neighbor as the essential unit of a community.
Right. Yeah, one just calling yourself pro-marriage or pro-family within the context of the Heritage Foundation doing what it's doing right now. It just, I find it to be very surreal, because it's as though that conversation isn't happening at all. And then all that's happening are these like mean feminist attacks on the family. It just seems totally out of touch with our current political reality.
Absolutely. And it plays into that framing that like, well, if you're not, you know, in favor of the nuclear family, then you must be against what? Care, connection? You know, what?
Yeah. Right. Can't we appreciate care and connection, but within a broader context? Like, why is that just equated with the family?
And as if every critique of the nuclear family is not an effort to deprivatize care and love and, you know, make it something that is available to all, whether they are, you know, married or in a nuclear family structure or not.
Right. Isn't it more deeply invested in care and connection and love? Yes.
Right. And also, like, that framing is almost never applied to men, right? It's nearly always used as like a character trait for women. Yeah, right. Yeah, a character trait, right. Like, there is this subtle kind of morality at play, I think, even in these liberal, you know, feminist conversations about being pro-family. It's maybe not so kind of explicit or doesn't feel as throwback as the right-wing approaches, but it's there. Totally. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about how the nuclear family serves white men and why we are anti-nuclear family. Is that fair to say, Tracy?
Yeah. Yes, it's fair to say.
And, you know, what does that mean if the nuclear family serves white men? What does that mean for women's roles within a family of any shape? We are recording this just a few days after Mother's Day. Therefore, just after the Trump administration announced their new website, moms.gov. Tracy, did you see the announcement about the website?
Yes, I did. And I saw Dr. Oz trot out the term underbabied at the White House event announcing this stupid website. For any listeners who missed it, he said that American women are, quote, underbabied when they don't have kids or don't have as many kids as they would otherwise like to have.
Right. And wasn't there like a weird conversation about men's fertility too and their sperm counts and like, what are these guys doing? I just,
Wake me up from this nightmare.
Truly. Trump also called himself the father of fertility. Not sure if you caught that.
I missed that, but that's disgusting.
Yeah, I'm sorry to have to share that with you. So, I mean, obviously we see the way in which pronatalism is intersecting with these notions of family. It was a lot of shallow pageantry and fanfare, the announcement about moms.gov. And, you know, lots of discussion of how important moms are to this country and how the administration plans to support moms. Of course, they are, as you said, actively making it harder for single mothers to thrive. The site also pushes bogus health info. I found some of it to be pretty blatantly fatphobic. And it has a link to, quote, find pregnancy centers near you. The linked website is Option Line, which is operated by the Christian anti-abortion organization Heartbeat International. So what does all this tell us about this country's relationship to mothers and how motherhood fits into the culture wars over family?
Yeah. Well, so I'm fresh off book tour, as you know, and so I'm afraid I'm thinking of something for my book. As you mentioned, Sylvia Federici talks about how the housewife was an invention of capitalism, an unpaid job that women were strong-armed into accepting, in part because it was a role that conferred respectability and honor. I write in my book about how this was the opposite of the shame that was heaped on sex workers. Housewives were paid in respect, right? Not in an income, not in money, but in respect. So, of course, I'm thinking about how mothers are paid in this kind of superficial pageantry, to your point. But the honor is calculated and conniving. Underlying all of this is the intent to exploit and oppress women and mothers.
Yeah, so true. I mean, there's that privatization of reproductive labor. There's that privatization of sexual labor. And, you know, as you said, this is also cementing the sort of like virgin whore dichotomy, right? You're inside the family, you're protected, yet exploited, and outside you're abandoned. While campaigns like these purport to embrace the power of motherhood, conservatives and others who are clinging to the nuclear family as the only definition of family actually seem to me to be quite fearful of more radical, fully embodied, and politicized motherhood, especially when it comes to motherhood that does not include a man in the house or anywhere on the scene. There is definitely a longstanding fear of the single mother in this country. You know, this has been written about extensively, you know, by feminists, and a very active campaign against the single mom as someone who will suck national resources dry. We've seen this a lot in this administration's rhetoric. This is in part because while the work women do as mothers and in their homes is materially undervalued, our intimate domestic lives are still the site of social reproduction. So this is what Federici, Maria Rosa della Costa, Selma James, Leopolda Fortunati, Maria Mies, and other socialist feminists found, that the home was a site of extraction and exploitation of women, but also that the work being done there was the very work on which the reproduction of society rested. So that's dangerous. In fact, mothers have a lot of power.
Yeah. I mean, the truth is they only honor mothers when they're exploiting them. And there is a radical opportunity for all mothers to disrupt that process, to refuse to reproduce certain norms.
Exactly. It makes me think of how Erica Kirk said in her eulogy for her husband that, this is a quote, "If you're a mother, please recognize that it is the single most important ministry you have." Kirk and conservatives more broadly, I will give it to them, understand that family is the sphere of social reproduction, right? It's literally the place where we reproduce society as it is or in some other way, right? But the world that people like Erica Kirk think that we should be reproducing in our homes is a white Christian nationalist one.
Yeah. In more progressive circles, we have this similar understanding that parenting is political, but the idea among progressives is to challenge normative and oppressive ways of being and relating to each other.
Right. And in that vision of the family, you know, your work as a parent is not just this individualistic pursuit of giving your kids the happiest, most optimized childhood, building your real estate portfolio, whatever, but teaching them to be citizens of the world and agents of change, you know, little warriors for justice, teaching them to live against oppressive norms and institutions and to be part of a community, to be a good neighbor, you know, which brings me back to what we were saying about this notion of stability or health of a society. You know, what does it mean to have a stable home, family, community? You know, for many of us, you know, it's a home that is a door to a better, more connected world. It's a home for others that is as normative as possible. And I think a lot of Danny McClain's writing in We Live for the We, which is a really wonderful book about the radical power of Black motherhood. She opens the book with a quote from Bay Area legend Cat Brooks, who says that for Black mothers, the job is, quote, to keep pushing the liberation ball down the court. Our obligation is to leave the world better for them, kids, and to ensure that they are equipped with the tools that they need to fight. We don't live for the I, we live for the we. And, I try to always come back to this in my own parenting. The goal of feminist parenting is not actually comfort or just my individual child's optimization or success, right? It's to push that ball down the court and to teach them how to do that too and how to care about that.
Right. I love that. Yeah, and this is reflective of what's happening in a lot of feminist infighting right now. This idea that feminist work should make us comfortable or else it's bad. But when we live for this sense of the we, the collective discomfort is part of that too, actually, right?
Right. Discomfort is good, actually.
Yes.
Often.
Yes.
I also want to introduce this more recent idea of Federici's, shared by many Marxist feminists, that while it's misleading to say the family is in crisis, right, this implication that there's something wrong with the changing shape of families as more and more people move away from the nuclear model, the sphere of social reproduction is in crisis. This is kind of to what you were saying earlier. So I thought I would ask you to read this quote from a 2019 paper called Social Reproduction Theory, History, Issues, and Present Challenges in Radical Philosophy. This is Silvia Federici.
Sure. There is an immense work in which we as feminists have to engage to denounce profound crisis of social reproduction that entire populations across the world are experiencing because of the impoverishment capitalist development is producing. Due to the defunding of social programs, the politics of extractivism, and the now permanent state of warfare. We also need to write about the war that is being conducted against proletarian children and public schools, about the misery in which many elderly people are living, about the new forms of slavery constructed through the mass incarceration of Black youth, and above all, about the struggle that can be made against these injustices. Yes, Federici, always for the win. So the crisis is not the loss of male heads of household or declining marriage or birth rates, but rather the intentional abandonment of social policies that would actually help children and families of all kinds.
Exactly. Yes. And I find that a much more useful frame than saying something like, if they want us to have more children, they should give us paid leave, right? Which we see a lot these days, which just plays into the hands of pronatalists.
Right. Like we will reproduce for them if they just, do X, Y, Z.
Right. Which also, sidesteps the idea that some women don't want to have children, right? And that for the first time in history, they have that choice.
Yes.
Right. And honestly, this frame, that Federici offers, thinking about the crisis of the sphere of social reproduction, I think also asks us to take a lot more seriously the violence and horrible inequality that we subject children to.
Right. Instead of focusing on this defense of the family across the political spectrum, while ignoring these issues that should be centered, right?
Right, exactly. If these people really care about the quote-unquote family, which we could presume doesn't only include white men, it also includes children and women, what are they doing?
Yeah. Exactly.
All of their policies are anti-child and anti-woman, Global warfare, which, look around, right, at what this administration is doing. It predominantly hurts women and children, right? So it's what does a family actually mean when we even talk about the nuclear family, right? Who are we actually talking about protecting? It's men.
Yes, Exactly. Exactly. Well, and it's just that's why it's so absurd that we allow them to set the terms of the debate in this way, right?
Right.
Like it when you lay it out like this, their pro-family policies are so blatantly, obviously anti-family, anti-people, anti-children, anti-love, you know?
Yes, yes.
Anti-equity. And yeah, so let's not be so reactive to it, and God, find ways to defend the family or defend motherhood as liberal feminists. Like, what a waste of time. What are we even doing if that's the approach that your feminism is taking?
Yes. Mic drop, Tracy. Well, I just love that frame, and I think it's a really good place to land, especially since this is the final episode of the first ever Dire Straits season.
I can't believe it.
It's so crazy. I think that we have, looked at a lot of these problems from a lot of different angles, but I think that we're at an inflection point nationally, globally. I think that the sort of like machinations of these evil dudes are really being exposed for what they are, and so I love landing here in this conversation about this problematic framing around family, right? And asking that question of what would it mean for us to be pro-child, right? And pro-women and pro-racial equality and anti-war, right? And that all of these things are much more important than insisting that, quote unquote, the family, that marriage, that these are somehow what's going to save us, when we've tried that. We tried that for lots of centuries.
Yeah.
And it's always been really obvious why we were doing that and who that was benefiting.
Yeah.
So let's try something else. And
yes. How about?
And I think that's where we're going to pick up season 2. So come back.
Yeah.
We'll see you in a couple weeks. We're going to have some really exciting episodes. In the meantime, you can join us at direstraitspod.com. That's Straits with a GH, and let us know what you most want to see us cover next season. Until then, have a good summer.
See you soon. Bye. Bye.